Of Numbers, and we're going to start in chapter 31. Chapter 31, and this is our last class in Numbers, so we are going to rush through an overview, basically, of the last 6 chapters of the book of Numbers. Hopefully, with the last 10 or so minutes of class, we'll do a review, discuss a little bit what we've learned from Numbers, and then be ready to start Deuteronomy a week from Sunday. So, here's the overview quickly of where we are. We are in this final section, or this final location. Remember, the book of Numbers, you'll be quizzed on this at the end of class, is 3 locations that the people are traveling to in the wilderness, starting at Mount Sinai, the first 10 chapters, on the road for a little while, get to the wilderness of Paran in the middle of the book, 13 and 19, travel for a little bit in 20 and 21, and then come to the final location, the wilderness or the plains of Moab, just across the river from the promised land, and that's where we are as the book concludes. Remember, there's also another way of structuring the book that helps us to understand what's going on, and that is the 2 times in the book that the Israelite fighting men are counted in a census. This is what how the book of Numbers gets its name, and it's famous for these countings. The first census is in chapter 1. It's followed by a series of instructions that is preparing the Israelites for life in the wilderness. And once they're prepared and ready to go, they set out and immediately start failing. They start grumbling, they start complaining, and receiving the wrath of God. A lot of people die, a lot of different punishments that take place in the wilderness because of the people's rebellion. That first generation, therefore, dies out completely, and there is a second census of the second generation that takes place in the plains of Moab in Numbers chapter 26. Similar to the pattern of the first census, that second census is followed by a series of instructions for preparing the people not to live in the wilderness, but now to go live in the promised land where they are headed. And those preparations are followed by stories, not stories of failure and death, but stories of, for the most part, conquest, optimism, and settling and entering into their promised land. And nobody dies after that second census in Numbers 26 to the end of the book. And so there's a significant note of hope and optimism as the book of Numbers concludes, and the people are looking across the river, as we will see, the very last verse of the book, looking across the river to the city of Jericho, kind of foreshadowing their conquest that will take place shortly. Okay, so we're jumping into these last 6 chapters. Here's basically what happens. Chapter 31, we have another story of victory. We've seen some of these already. But God will command the people to slaughter the Midianites, and I don't think that's spelled correctly, but oh well. Then in chapter 32, we will see the first tribes begin to settle themselves in some of the land, but we'll talk about that because it's a little bit of a controversial settlement in Numbers 32. That's probably where we'll spend the majority of our time tonight, reading and talking. Then in chapter 33, there is a list of all the locations that the people stayed and stopped in their wilderness from Egypt to the promised land. In chapter 35, we have a detailed apportioning, not of each individual tribe's land, but of the outermost borders of the land of Canaan that Israel is going to receive. Then in chapter 35, there is instructions of the cities that are given to the Levites, the cities of refuge in particular. We're talking about what those are for. And then in chapter 36, there's some final laws or instructions really that are given about inheriting the land. And the daughters of Zelophehad come back in the story for a great cameo at the end of the story before Numbers concludes there. So let's jump in and stop me at any time if there's anything you want to talk more about or any questions you want to ask. Real quickly, 31, you can be looking at it in your text. We're not really going to read, but I will point some things out. It is interesting to note that in verse 2, it says that God told Moses, "Take full vengeance for the sons of Israel on the Midianites." Afterward, you will be gathered to your people. So this is going to be Moses' last hurrah, Moses' last battle at least. And he's told that the people are to take full vengeance against the Midianites. For what, the question would be. And do you remember? For what do the Midianites deserve this full vengeance? Yes, thank you, Cecilio. In Numbers 25, the Midianites were involved in tricking or tempting or leading or giving the opportunity to the Israelites to commit idolatry and immorality, the sin of the Baal of Peor. And you see a reference in verse 7 of Numbers 31 to the fact that they will kill every male. Notice in verse 8, they also kill Balaam, the son of Beor. So remember, Balaam was the one who, after trying to curse Israel, was the one who advised Balak, king of Moab, to use the Midianites or to work with the Midianites to tempt the people in Numbers chapter 25. Okay? And that is explicitly described in verse 16 of Numbers 31. They caused the sons of Israel through the counsel of Balaam to trespass against the Lord in the matter of Peor. So the plague was among the congregation. Okay, so they're told to make a full vengeance and to kill every male. All right? After this is over, Moses finds out that, I guess in following the instructions that they were given, the Israelite army has killed all the males, but they have spared the women and children. The reason Moses is upset about that in verses 14 to 18 is that the women, at least some of them, were active participants in getting the Israelites to sin at Peor, and so they are to be held accountable for their sin. And so the women and the male children are killed, slaughtered according to the commandment that it was given to them by the Lord. Only the virgin women are left alive by the Israelite army. They purify themselves after this event. They purify even the articles of metal and of leather, the implements that they use and that they collected from the Midianites. And the rest of the chapter describes how all of that spoil is taken. It is taxed, so the Levites receive their due, the people receive their due, the tribes that were involved in the victory divide up the spoil, distribute the spoil among themselves. And then there is this kind of easy to miss but pretty incredible note in the last few verses of the chapter that the officers of each of the tribes who gave 1,000 men, each of the 12 tribes, the officers come and say that they are going to make this offering, verse 50, of articles of gold, armlets and bracelets, signet rings, earrings and necklaces to make atonement for ourselves before the Lord. So they're going to give the gold, at least a portion of the gold from the spoils to the Lord. And it says in verse 52 that it added up to 16,750 shekels, which is over 400 pounds of gold that is offered to the Lord and taken as a memorial into the tent of meeting, according to verse 54. Okay, anything on the slaughter of Midian, spoils that were taken, divided up, offered to the Lord? Yes, Michael?
I have some questions.
Okay.
So when they sinned with it said the daughters of Moab. So is a Moabite the same thing as a Midianite?
It is not the same thing. If you go back to chapter 22, the beginning of the Balaam story, it mentions both the Midianites and the Moabites. So for instance, in 22:3, Moab was in great fear because of the people. They were numerous, and Moab was in dread of the sons of Israel. Moab said to the elders of Midian, "Now this horde will lick up all that is around us." So they're working together. Also, the Midianites were a nomadic group. In fact, if you read the details of the battle in Numbers 31, you'll see that it talks about them destroying the encampments of the Midianites and taking their stuff. So it appears that they were nomadic and they had tents or kind of temporary settlements. And so the Midianites were all over, and this group was kind of in and around working together with the Moabites.
My second question is, didn't Moses flee to Midian way back, and he married a woman from Midian, or Zipporah, Boraz's son?
I thought about that. Yeah.
Is this the same people?
Well, I don't know. I thought about the same thing. I didn't do a deep dive research on that. I'm assuming maybe it's related to the fact that they are a nomadic and spread out people. So if Moses fled to one area where there were Midianites, that doesn't necessarily mean the same thing as that they were the same exact people or directly, maybe extended family, I don't know, to these other Midianites who are somewhere else. But the short answer is I don't know. The real answer is I don't know. All right. Cool. Let's slow down a little bit and read a good portion here of Numbers chapter 32, okay? Because this is a significant event that takes place here. Like I said, it's the first time that any of the land is going to be apportioned out to the tribes. And I think the conversation that takes place here between these tribes and Moses is significant in the context of what we have seen in the book of Numbers. In fact, you will see that several of our previous stories from Numbers are referenced and discussed in this chapter. So we won't read quite the whole thing, but let's read the first 30 verses or so of Numbers chapter 32. It says, "Now the sons of Reuben and the sons of Gad had an exceedingly large number of livestock. So when they saw the land of Jazer and the land of Gilead, that it was indeed a place suitable for livestock, the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben came and spoke to Moses and to Eleazar the priest and the leaders of the congregation, saying," all these guys in verse 3. Verse 4, "The land which the Lord conquered before the congregation of Israel is a land for livestock, and your servants have livestock. They said, if we have found favor in your sight, let this land be given to your servants as a possession. Do not take us across the Jordan." But Moses said to the sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben, "Shall your brothers go to war while you yourselves sit here? Now, why are you discouraging the sons of Israel from crossing over into the land which the Lord has given them? This was what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to see the land. For when they went up to the valley of Eshcol and saw the land, they discouraged the sons of Israel so that they did not go into the land which the Lord had given them. So the Lord's anger burned in that day, and he swore, saying, none of the men who came up from Egypt from 20 years old and upward shall see the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, for they did not follow me fully, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite and Joshua the son of Nun, for they have followed the Lord fully." Verse 13, "So the Lord's anger burned against Israel. He made them wander in the wilderness 40 years until the entire generation of those who had done evil in the sight of the Lord was destroyed. Now behold, you have risen up in your father's place, a brood of sinful men, to add still more to the burning anger of the Lord against Israel. For if you turn away from following him, he will once more abandon them in the wilderness, and you will destroy all these people." Tell us how you really feel, Moses. Verse 16, "Then they came near to him and said, we will build here sheepfolds for our livestock and cities for our little ones, but we ourselves will be armed, ready to go before the sons of Israel, until we have brought them to their place, while our little ones live in the fortified cities because of the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until every one of the sons of Israel has possessed his inheritance, for we will not have an inheritance with them on the other side of the Jordan and beyond, because our inheritance has fallen to us on this side of the Jordan toward the east." So Moses said to them, "If you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before the Lord for war, and all of you armed men cross over the Jordan before the Lord until he has driven his enemies out before him, and the land is subdued before the Lord, then afterward you shall return and be free of obligation toward the Lord and toward Israel, and this land shall be yours for a possession before the Lord. But if you will not do so, behold, you have sinned against the Lord, and be sure your sin will find you out. Build yourselves cities for your little ones and sheepfolds for your sheep, and do what you have promised." The sons of Gad and the sons of Reuben spoke to Moses, saying, "Your servants will do just as the Lord commands. Our little ones, our wives, our livestock, and our cattle shall remain there in the cities of Gilead, while your servants, everyone who is armed for war, will cross over in the presence of the Lord to battle, just as my Lord says." Okay, we'll stop there and ask you this question. There's a proposal from these two tribes. We learned later there's also the half tribe of Manasseh. So these 2.5 tribes make this proposal Moses is upset about it, and they come to an agreement. What do you learn? What do we learn from this dispute and this agreement? And that's intentionally broad. What do we learn about the people at this point in their journey? What do we learn for us? Reflections on this story here in Numbers 32. Are you getting on to Moses, Muffy? Muffy says don't make assumptions before you go off on somebody or talk to somebody. That's what you mean, right? It's about you feel like Moses is not in the wrong, but maybe overly quick. Is that your contention? Okay. Thank you, Muffy.
They were planning to or they said they would help
Yeah.
and fight the battles. They
Yeah.
weren't just going to let them cross and deal with all the battles themselves.
Yeah, thank you, Muffy. Yeah, I've wondered about that. I've wondered if, Moses jumps into his whole thing and he's given this history lesson. They're thinking, we know, let us finish. We didn't get a chance to actually explain. Yeah, that's interesting. Other reflections on what this story says about where the people are at, how far they've come, lessons for us, anything like that? Yeah, Shannon.
Be sure your sin will find you out. That just stands out to me. That's what we learn. Be sure your sin will find you out.
And yeah, it's a powerful verse. It's a powerful statement there in 32:23, as Shannon points out. Your sin will find you out. You saw that a little bit in the last chapter, right? Balaam thought he was being slick by giving that advice to the Moabites back in chapter 25, and he was found out for his sin. All those women and the Midianites who participated in that, they were found out and paid for their sins. And you see that here, again, that guarantee, I was going to say a threat, but that guarantee of Moses. I did see someone point out today, it's interesting, the specific sin in this case is what? So Moses' statement at the end, your sin will find you out if you don't follow through with this oath. What would be the specific sin that would find them out in this case? Yeah, not contributing, not joining the fight. That was the sin. It's kind of interesting because obviously you find here a principle that would apply to all sin. So if we're involved in, the sin, a sexual sin, or we're involved in some sort of theft or greed that we're keeping secret to ourselves, your sin will find you out. But in this context, the sin is not fighting, not joining the effort as you're supposed to. And don't think you can just loaf and let everybody else fight, everyone else do the work. Don't think you can just avoid the danger, avoid the risk, take the comfortable route. God says your sin will find you out if you think you can skate by that way. And so maybe that adds another layer of severity to it. Okay. Anything else from the story here of the 2.5 tribes? Yeah, Mike.
Also applicable to today. When are you going to learn? I don't need that. Applicable to today is that we can't just sit back and let everybody else fight the good fight. We can't just sit and be comfortable on the pew on Sunday mornings and Wednesday nights and just let everybody else get out there and fight the fight. We've got our responsibilities too. That's what is coming across in this particular instance. All the men had the responsibility to get out here and do this.
No, amen. Thank you, Mike. And especially, you think about they were going to be fighting for a land that they themselves were not going to be living in, right? And oftentimes I think we do have a little bit of an individualistic attitude of like, well, I'll do what I need to do to get mine, right? But you're on your own, right? And that's not the picture you see here. The picture is that everybody contributes for everybody's welfare, and they're willing to go across and fight, even though technically all the land they're fighting for is just going to be their brothers. But my land is your land, and your land is my land, and we're all in it together is kind of the idea. So yeah, get up and contribute. Do your part. Yeah. Okay. I do think, I just throw all these up here. Again, in the context of Numbers, the fact that Moses refers back to the sin of Kadesh Barnea, the sin of seeing the promised land the first time around and not wanting to go in, he's very concerned about that. He warns them of that kind of faithlessness. And because that's referenced, I wonder if you have in this chapter, as we alluded to earlier, this kind of demonstration of growth, right, or of maturity, right? That now this second generation, they are not going to, at least not yet, repeat the mistakes of their fathers. And I say not yet. I mean, obviously, no generation of Israel was perfect, but yet, maybe about this same generation, the generation of Joshua is the generation that said in Joshua 1 that they were faithful all the days of Joshua, right? So maybe the optimism will hold out into to the early days of the Promised Land. But they are not going to repeat the mistakes of their fathers. They are willing to go in and to fight for the land, even to help their brothers fighting for the land. And so, at the end of the chapter, 33 to 42, we have the official bestowing. Moses gave them the land, to Gad, to Reuben, and to a half-tribe of Manasseh, who will settle on the east side of the Jordan. I'll show you a map here in a little bit. Yeah, Michael?
I don't know if this is a worthy thought, but didn't God promise them like something great? And they're kind of like, they saw something else and they're like, well, I think this is good. And like, doesn't that show kind of maybe the faithlessness you're showing, like instead of like trusting God and going where the place he promised them, they're kind of like, well, this looks good. I don't know. Nobody had said anything, but I kind of wonder if that's one of the things we should think about.
Yeah, I think it's a valid thought. It is hard to know exactly how to evaluate everything here, right? But I think you are onto something. There is at least an element of, and that's kind of what I was implying with this short statement up here for verses 1 to 5. I think there is a little bit of an element of like, well, this looks pretty good to us, right? And maybe it would be nice to not have to go across the Jordan if we can just, get this land right here. So yeah, I don't think that's necessarily wrong. I think you're onto something. I don't think that they are given the land, right? And this is all blessed by God, right? So they're not in utter rebellion by any means. But there does seem to be at least some motivation of an easier path or something, right? As opposed to going full on in. And I don't know if this means anything. It could just be geographic realities. But you come to, where is it? I have it written down here. But somewhere in Kings and Chronicles. Where is that? 1 Chronicles 5. These 2.5 tribes on the east side of the Jordan are the first ones gone. Again, maybe geographic reality of Assyria coming from the northeast, but it is these eastern tribes that are the first ones taken into captivity. So does that tell us something, right? I don't know, but it is interesting at least. So no, I think what you have to say is valid. All right. Real quickly, 33 is, as you see it in your Bible, it's just a listing of all the places they went. Can't help myself. In verse 2, it is interesting. We, earlier on in the year, in some of the lessons, and one of the lessons, I should say, that we did about the Bible, the How Firm a Foundation series, we noted how in Exodus we read of the first time that Moses is actually told by God to write down Scripture, to write something down. And here in Numbers 33, verse 2, is the only place in Numbers that we actually see, kind of behind the scenes, Moses being told to write something down. And what is he told to write down? Write down all the places you stayed along the way. And it's like 40-something places. As you see, it's a long list of all the places they camped on their journey. So it's just an interesting kind of fact, interesting reality that God told him to do that. And I thought, that may be an interesting exercise for us to do. What if we went back? We've talked about Numbers as kind of representative of our spiritual journey. What if you went back and started and kind of where did I come from spiritually and kind of traced out, right? All the different progressions that we've made in our lives In fact, in 2 Peter chapter 1, which is a passage all about making progress in the spiritual life, right? Add to your faith virtue, and virtue knowledge. And, if you don't keep progressing, you're going to fall back and be destroyed. He says in the midst of that some people stop progressing because they forget that they were cleansed of their former sins, right? So as I heard someone say as a high schooler, right, there's a reason why the windshield is this big and the rearview mirror is this big. We got to be looking forward and not looking backward. And yet, sometimes looking backward can be helpful. To remember where we've been, remember where we've come from, remember what God has done for us, see the ways that He's provided for us every step of the way, to fill our hearts with gratitude and humility, to face ahead and do what it is that God has told us to do, right? So there's my mini sermon on the most boring chapter in all of Numbers, all right? Numbers 34, we get the land boundary. So I'll just show it to you here instead of pointing it out or reading it to you. So you're familiar with this map, right? But here in Numbers, this green area here plus this lighter area, these are the eastern tribes over here. The tribes are not on this map. They're on the next one I'll show you. But this eastern part is where those tribes had asked for their land, the good pasture land. And then this green area is what's described in Numbers 34. And if you remember some maps of later on in Israelite history, it's actually kind of rare, as in it almost never happens that they have this entire land controlled and to themselves. It does happen a handful of times, but this was at least the ideal of the land that they were to possess that was given to them as an inheritance by God. That's very hard to see. Apologize for that. But you see the tribal allotments there. Again, that's not in Numbers 34. We learn that later on. But just so you have a sense of where the different tribes ended up. And like I said, on the eastern side of the Jordan here, Manasseh, Gad, Reuben settled there in the Transjordan, as it's called. And the rest of the tribes settle over here in the Promised Land proper. Okay? Questions, comments, concerns? Cool. Yeah, Steve.
Do you know how much property it takes to take care of 100 head?
I don't know.
675,000 head, and that's not counting the donkeys. And I mean, think about the amount of food, the water supply. Listen, the only way in the world that could be possible, in my mind, of course, I'm not a rancher, certainly not of sheep, but it would appear to me that Jehovah would have to be a part of that effort in order to be able to keep up with that. You're talking about upwards of 2 million people and 675,000 sheep. So I just wondered if you thought about that and gave that any consideration. For me, that's just a phenomenal idea, just a thought. So maybe I'm weird. I know I'm weird, but that's the thought that hits me. It's amazing to me. It's just the logistics of that. Yeah.
No, I think you're exactly right. It is amazing, and it's one of several details you could point to say the only way this works is if God is leading them. And God intended all that. I mean, you could think of a number of passages where God is saying, look, you're not a very big, special, powerful people, right? I'm the one that's been taking care of you and making this happen, right? Again, it just as an example, Rahab sees all that when they show up in Jericho saying, we've heard, right? And we know that your God is the one who's doing all this, right? So, no, thank you. Okay, cities of refuge are described in Numbers 35. Now, remember that it said, I don't have the chapter reference for you, I apologize for that. But remember that the tribe of Levi did not receive inheritance in the land. That's what we were told earlier, okay? That's basically true. They didn't receive a kind of regional allotment like we saw with the other tribes. But we learned in Numbers 35 that the Levites do receive cities. They receive 48 cities. It says in verse 7, And 6 of those cities, by the way, each city includes pasture land around the city because there were animals, livestock that the Levites would be given as their due and also take care of for all the sacrifices and so on. So 48 cities in pasture land. And 6 of those cities spaced out across the land, 3 on the western side of the Jordan, 3 on the eastern side of the Jordan, kind of north, central, and south. 6 of these cities, evenly spaced out, are to be cities of refuge. Does anybody remember what the cities of refuge, what their function was? Why would you need to go to a city of refuge? Yeah, it really is a way to ensure justice, right? Because if someone dies at your hands, you can flee to the city of refuge. Not to escape justice, but again, just the opposite. To get there and to ensure that you have a fair trial, right? And so Numbers 35 lays out kind of the logistics of the cities of refuge, and then it goes through and describes kind of the various situations and how justice is to be doled out. Verse 16 to 21 is very clear. If you commit murder, and it gives some definitions of murder versus what we call manslaughter, which I assume are somewhat similar to what they are today. Lori Beth, I'm sure, give us a great rundown of all the differences between murder and manslaughter. So we'll do a workshop, murder-manslaughter workshop after Bible class with Lori Beth. But at least in Numbers 35, there are some stipulations on what classifies it as murder, what classifies it as manslaughter. If you're guilty of murder, you're to be put to death. Again, you cannot escape justice. If you're guilty of manslaughter, you have to stay confined in the city of refuge where you fled to until the high priest, that is currently the high priest, dies, right? So there is a penalty, but it is a different penalty than the penalty for murder. And you see at the end of the chapter, 29 to 34, some things that we've seen before that you see other places in Scripture. Notice starting in verse 30 of Numbers 35. If anyone kills a person, the murderer shall be put to death at the evidence of witnesses, but no person shall be put to death on the testimony of one witness. So we're familiar with that. It has to be 2 or 3 witnesses that give testimony here. Verse 31, you shall not take ransom for the life of a murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. You shall not take ransom for him who has fled to a city of refuge, that he may return to live in the land before the death of the priest. So you can't be bought out, right? The rich are not favored. You can't pay a ransom for someone who has to pay the penalty for murder or for manslaughter, right? So there's fairness and equality there in how the law is executed. And then verse 33, you shall not pollute the land in which you are, for blood pollutes the land, and no expiation can be made for the land for the blood that is shed in it, except by the blood of him who shed it. You shall not defile the land in which you live, in the midst of which I dwell, for I, the Lord, am dwelling in the midst of the sons of Israel. This becomes a critical piece of the logic that the prophets will use for all of Israel's history. They talk about the fact that the people's sins, particularly their violence, have polluted the land, so the land is going to vomit them out, right? God has to remove the people from the land eventually because they have corrupted it, they have defiled it, and the land needs to rest and have some peace because of all the violence that has been committed on it, all the bloodshed that has taken place on it. And so again, you see the building blocks of all of that, teachings of justice that the prophets will sound over and over again here in Numbers 35 and the cities of refuge. Okay, real quick, we end, of course, the book of Numbers with the daughters of Zelophehad. You remember the story of the daughters of Zelophehad? Recap real quick. This is Numbers 27. What did the daughters of Zelophehad ask for back in Numbers 27? A portion, inheritance. Why? Their dad had been given a portion, but he died. Has no sons. It's just all daughters, right? So they go to Moses and say, hey, basically we deserve to have the land. And what does Moses say? He says, it's a good question. Let me check, right? Goes to God. God says, they're right. Give them the land. right? And that's decided in Numbers 27. So the daughters of Zelophehad get their inheritance. Then, in the last chapters of Numbers, the folks from Manasseh, who that's the same tribe, by the way, that's the tribe of the daughters of Zelophehad, they say, wait a minute, the daughters of Zelophehad have this inheritance. What if they marry somebody else from a different tribe, and then the inheritance that they receive that belongs to our tribe is going to get like sucked away into the tribe of whoever they marry, if it's of a different tribe. So they bring that to Moses. And Moses says, interestingly, well, it says that God said to Moses, or Moses spoke the word of the Lord, whatever. So apparently God says, the sons of Joseph are right. This is the same exact thing that he said of the daughters of Zelophehad. The daughters of Zelophehad are right. Here he says the sons of Joseph are right. Okay, they have a legitimate concern. Remember, God was very particular in Numbers 27 that the land always stay within the family, within the clan, the tribe that it was first allotted to, because it was their inheritance. It's a family inheritance. And God was serious about that. So God respects the concern of the tribe of Manasseh that their land, through the daughters of Zelophehad, might get kind of siphoned off to another tribe. And so he gives follow-up instructions for the daughters of Zelophehad, or anyone in their case, to marry within the tribe so that the land stays within the tribe. And it says in verse 10, just as the Lord had commanded Moses, so the daughters of Zelophehad did. And in verse 11, they're all named again, and they marry their uncle's sons, and they marry those from the families of the sons of Manasseh, the son of Joseph, and their inheritance remained with the tribe of the family of their father. And then notice the last verse of the entire book of Numbers, verse 13. These are the commandments and the ordinances which the Lord commanded to the sons of Israel through Moses in the plains of Moab by the Jordan opposite Jericho. So in a book that is famous for rebellion and grumbling and disobedience and punishment and dying in the wilderness, the last note of the book that is sounded is one of inquiring again of God, of getting ready to receive the promised land, of obedience to the instructions of God on the part of the daughters of Zelophehad, and ending in verse 13, looking across the river to Jericho. Again, as I said earlier, kind of foreshadowing. If this was the end of one mini-series, you'd end with the camera panning out to see Jericho across the river. And we know that, not in the next book, but after Deuteronomy, we're coming back to Jericho, and that will be the scene of God's first great conquest in the land of Canaan. All right? Cool. About 7 minutes left, so let's do our big review. These are 2 slides here. So I'll just have you look at all the questions first in ominous silence, and then I will ask you, we'll run through them one at a time. So just glance down through and see how many of those questions you know the answer to. I'll give you 90 seconds or so to do that. Howard and Patty trying to cheat over there. See? Okay, how you feeling? Over 50%, maybe? Over 75%? What's the name of the book of Numbers in Hebrew? Well, the English translation of the name of the book in Hebrew. In the wilderness. Thank you, Stephen. In the wilderness. What are the 3 main locations in the book of Numbers? Sinai, Paran, Moab. What's going on at Sinai in chapters 1 to 10? They're getting ready, getting organized, getting prepared to go. This was maybe a poorly worded question. What did the tribes do in chapter 10? Not yet. That's the answer to the next question. They leave, yeah. Chapter 10 says the cloud picked up and left, and the people picked up and left, right? So 1 to 10, they're getting ready to go. In chapter 10 is when they go, right? Then, Robert, how do they behave in chapters 11 and 12? As soon as they hit the road, haven't even made it to Buc-ee's in Baytown. The kids are already complaining and kicking each other and, questioning you for, who gave you the authority to drive this car, right? That's 11 and 12. What are the two big complaints in the wilderness of Paran in 13 and 19? So one of them is leadership. These are not the first complaints. These are the two big ones in this section. The super big one is, in quotes, the big one is in 13 and 14. That's the denial of the promised land. That's the spies going in, grumbling about the giants and the walls, and the people saying, we're not going to go into the promised land. That's 13 and 14. That's the big complaint. The next one is in 16, also in 17. Famous for the wonderful life, floor opening up scene. Yeah, the rebellion of Korah. That's 16 and 17. So those are the big ones. Again, in that middle section of the book, right? It really, I feel like at the center of it, highlighting those two rebellions. The rebellion of the promised land, the rebellion against Moses and Aaron, and that's the middle section, okay? What's the consequence of the big sin at Kadesh Barnea in 13 and 14? 40 years in the wilderness, everybody's going to die, okay? Speaking of death, they hit the road in 20. Who dies on the road in 20? Miriam and Aaron both die. And what happens to Moses in that chapter? He sins how? Striking the rock, claiming to be the one that brings water to these rebels in the wilderness. And he is told he's not going to get it. So in one chapter we have Miriam dying, Moses told he's going to die before the promised land, and Aaron dying. And that encapsulates the first generation. Okay? We're pressed for time here. We'll keep going. Two great kings defeated in chapter 21. Og and Sihon. Sihon and Og, right? So we start to turn here a little bit. Turning point in the book in chapter 21. Then the next section of stories, 22 to 25. What do Balak and Balaam conspire to do together? Curse Israel. How does that go? They bless Israel instead. God won't let his people be cursed. What's Balaam's idea instead of cursing them? Tempt them to idolatry and immorality. Yeah. How many censuses in the book of Numbers? 2. Daughters of Zelophehad, we've already talked about that. Who succeeds Moses as leader? Joshua. Who are the tribes that settle east of the Jordan? Reuben, Gad, and half tribe of Manasseh. Okay, I missed one about New Testament references, so we'll do these together. Speaking of Balaam specifically, do you remember New Testament passages that refer to Balaam? There's 3 of them. Jude, 2 Peter 2, and Revelation 2. Yep. And then what are the other New Testament texts that reference the book of Numbers, or reference a story from the book of Numbers? 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Thank you, Cecilia. Bailed Shannon out there. 1 Corinthians 10. John 3, Patty, thank you. That's Jesus talking about what story? The bronze serpent. Thank you, Michael. See, this is a team effort here. And then, any more? There's one that's like a quotation of a psalm, and the psalm is also quoting or referring to the book of Numbers. So it's going to multi-layer. Yeah, Hebrews chapter 3 and 4 quote Psalm 95. Psalm 95 is a psalm about the sin of the waters of Meribah in the book of Numbers. Okay, very good. I got 7:45, so we will quit there. Thank you guys so much. I know Leviticus and Numbers have not necessarily been the easiest books to get through. You guys have done great. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. And the table is now set for Alex and HE to start teaching Deuteronomy. That's going to be a Sunday morning class starting a week from Sunday, December 1st. So get yourself in Deuteronomy, be reading it, be ready for that to start in about a week and a half. Thank you, guys.